let me begin by inviting Professor Ake Tangsupvattana, the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science, to give us some welcome remarks. Tran Ake, chenครับ
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to today's ISIS Forum on Water Politics, the South China Sea and the Mekong region. The South China Sea has become an area of geopolitical tensions, pitting ASEAN claimant states against China. The Philippines and Vietnam, in particular, have high stakes in the South China Sea, where China has built a string of artificial islands and in the area. In addition, the Mekong region in mainland Southeast Asia is another area of tensions arising from water resource utilization. China has built a string of upstream dams to the detriment of local communities and habits in downstream countries, particularly Cambodia and Vietnam. In both cases, regional and international governance frameworks by way of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea and the Mekong River Commission have proved inadequate in addressing these issues and challenges. This is not a forum to put China on the spot. ISIS Thailand and Chulalongkorn University want to serve as a platform for discussion and dialogue. We want to hear different views and perspectives in the spirit of cooperation and goodwill for a better collective understanding. Our discussion can also inform policymakers and provide a kind of a track to conversation that may assist intergovernmental relations among concerned states and government. In this spirit of informative and constructive dialogue, let me thank all to the speaker for sparing their time and for sharing their expertise with us. Dr. Tran has flown from Hanoi to be with us. So thank you very much. And many thanks also to Kavi Chongkittavorn, who is a senior fellow with ISIS Thailand, and also to Dr. Carl Middleton, who is a lecturer with the Faculty of Political Science here at Chula. Similarly, I am grateful to Mr. Li Hong from the Embassy of the Republic of China for being with us today. No discussion in our region, neighborhood, can lead to a constructive and mutually beneficial results without taking into account China's perspective. We want to hear from China, and we would like China to hear from the rest of the region. Last but not least, on behalf of ISIS Thailand, I would like to thank Mr. George Garfront and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for supporting this event. Let me now turn the floor to Ajahn Thitinan, and thank you for your kind attention.
As I tell students often these days, the world is not going to be good, but as analysts and students, it's very exciting times, very exciting times. I think things are happening. If you listen to some of the speeches at the UN recently in the last couple of days, you can sense that there's a lot more rising tension. But for us, I think our job is to try to decipher, incorporate, understand what is happening and what will happen. For Southeast Asia, for East Asia, I think the main player here is China. And here in Southeast Asia, we have ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries as a region, but ASEAN as a regional organization. And there are two main theaters of tension and issues, challenges. And they both have to do with water. So we call this forum water politics. We can say, well, the geopolitics of water utilization. We don't want to be more specific than that, but we also know that the South China Sea is very much contentious between China and between China and the ASEAN claimants. particularly the Philippines and Vietnam. We also know that the Mekong region, nearer to Thailand, Thailand is not a claimant in the South China Sea, but is very much a major stakeholder in the Mekong region. And along the Mekong River, there are some dams, a string of dams that have been constructed, and these dams have had effects on downstream communities and countries and governments. At the same time, we also know that in both of these arenas, the South China Sea, the Mekong region, there's not an adequate, sufficient, effective governing framework. That we have essentially what is a regional commons. This is regional resources that have to be utilized in a common fashion, but there's not an effective regional body, regional framework to resolve, mitigate, prevent, address issues and challenges and tensions. So today I really want to thank my colleagues and friends here, especially the first speaker, Dr. Thai, Dr. Tran Viet Thai. We attend various think tank workshops together in Asia and also in the US. So let me just invite Dr. Thai now to give us his presentation, about 20 minutes if you like, from the Vietnamese perspective, and then we'll move to the other speakers. Dr. Thai.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, thank you. Very special thanks to the organizers and Chulalongkorn University for inviting me. My name is Chan Viet Thai. I am DDG of the Institute for Strategic Studies, belonging to Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. I give lectures on political science and also on Mekong issues and South China Sea also. I am very happy and thanks for giving me the privilege to be the first speaker of our today's forums, and I will focus on both South China Sea and a little bit on Mekong issues from our Vietnam's perspective and our national interest. The first thing I would like to talk is about South China Sea. I will focus on the following the six points. The first point about the changing nature of South China Sea issue. If you look at the history of South China Sea issue before 2012, it was mainly territorial dispute between China and some South Asian countries. And it is not much internationalized, not much having, not much attention from media across the region. But since 2002, when ASEAN signed the declaration, the declaration on the Code of Conduct, or DOC, and until 2013, it became a regional issue, security issue between China and ASEAN. When South China Sea is no more territorial dispute, but it becomes a regional security issue, very much related to stability and peace in the regions. But even worse than that, since 2013 up to now, it became the nature of South China Sea issues from our perspective now becoming or involving even more serious issues, involving with the competition, strategic competitions between major powers, especially between US and China, and the more involvement of external powers into the regions, especially in the context of freedom and safety of navigation and overflight in the regions. So since 2013, water politics played much bigger role in South China Sea issues, and it is very much related to the waterway. And water politics in South China Sea issue is now an important part of the South China Sea issue. It is very much related to norms and key principles in international relations. It's regional orders, it's major powers competitions, and the strategic calculations of major powers. And if you can recall, since then, the second point I would like to mention here is that the Philippines sued China in PCA over Scarborough Shoal and over many other claims of Philippines between Philippines and China. And by 12th of June 2016, the PCA issued the arbitration rulings. And judging from that point of view, I think the PCA rulings have made the legal foundation of South China Sea issued very much clearer. The areas, the disputed areas have been reduced sharply. And it helped a lot in clarifying the legal base of countries, relating countries, especially between Philippines and China. But it is also very much related to Vietnam and other claimants in South China Sea. The next point I would like to talk is about China's policy. And of course, my colleagues, Mr. Li Hong, will also talk about that. But since 2013, China have a dual track policy on that. First one on the waters, we can see China finished building artificial islands. It gave China a lot of strategic advantages, especially with regard to the militarizations. They put China in a they are no longer on the defensive posture. They have the capability to control both on the water, in the air, and under the waters. And that affects a lot, not only our strategic environments, Vietnam's strategic environment, but also affect the heart of ASEAN, the core of peace and stability in the regions. And it affects China and ASEAN, US and ASEAN, and many other strategic relations between ASEAN and external relations, external powers. But on diplomacy, since the PCA rulings, China adopted quite softened diplomacy. The tone is now wiped down with, I think, high-level, very frequent high-level visits. It helped a lot in stabilizing the situations. But from our viewpoint, on the surface, everything seems to be calm, but under the water, everything's still the same. The nature not much changing. One of the key things we talk here is recently between China and ASEAN, both sides already finished the third round of negotiation on COC. And so far, both sides have achieved some early outcomes. The first outcome is that the first round in Vietnam, the second round in Hunan, China, and the third round in Cambodia. And so far, China and ASEAN already agree on the basic principles in negotiating on COC. Both sides also agree with each other on the single text and single draft of COC as a starting point for negotiation between the two sides. In the third round recently, as far as I know, China and ASEAN also agree with each other on the key objectives of COC. So COC documents will be adjusting behavior documents among parties, concerned parties. And it was designed to build peace and stability and to build trust among major powers and with ASEAN and among ASEAN itself in South China Sea. And on the principles, there are one key achievement recently that ASEAN and China agree with each other that signing COC documents between China and ASEAN will not affect the cooperation of ASEAN members and other countries. I think that is also very important. But there are still a lot of things still to be open and not yet to be solved and agreed upon. The first thing that where to be applicable, COC. We don't, ASEAN and China haven't talked about it yet. From ASEAN side, we want to apply COC for the whole South China Sea. You can see the map. That means northern part and southern part. The second key issue that how much legally binding it should be. China said that they are open to be, they are open for a COC to be legally binding. But how much open? What kind of binding it should be? We don't know yet. So it's still open. But if you look at the recent developments in South China Sea, and especially between China and US, you see that the future of COC is still far away from achieving something tangible, something substantive. On the one side, the prospect for South China Sea issue depends very much on China's, and depends very much on how China perceives its threats, especially the recent trade war. Even though China does not use the word war, the friction, they say that a trade friction, but in fact it's really a war. And it has some signals that it can be spilling over to other areas, not only in trade, but also in other areas. And 2 days ago, the US sent some big planes patrolling South China Sea. And you see France, UK, Australia, Japan, India, they are also contributing to patrolling the regions. So we see the future of South China Sea will be even more complicated. And we don't know yet what next. We hope ASEAN can be a good forum. And forum like this would be important for ASEAN countries to speak out their viewpoint. And priority should be given to peace, stability, and stable cooperation between ASEAN members and external parties. Now that is on our side, on South China Sea. Now I move to the second point on Mekong rivers. The issue of Mekong came up a little bit late, but it is equally important for ASEAN and for lower countries like Cambodia and Vietnam. There are some similarities between South China Sea and Mekong issue. That means it affects peace, it affects our development, environment, and it affects our strategy, foreign policy. It is also very much related to major powers. And if you look at the nature of the Mekong water issue, there are 4 key points that we cannot ignore. Number one is water use. How to share equally the waters between upper countries and lower countries is very important. So far, Mekong countries and China have not yet developed any agreements on that, on sharing these important resources. And we really want to, but not easy, because so far on Mekong River issue, we do not have any institutions to cover it. Second, building dams on mainstream. We recognize the need for developments in many countries, like Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, or Cambodia. But building dams on the mainstream will affect very seriously about water flow, about the environment, and about connectivities. The third issue is the connectivities. During the past 2 decades, Vietnam spent a lot of money on connectivities on 2 things, economic developments and infrastructures along Mekong rivers inside Vietnam and between Vietnam and Cambodia. And you see there are so many changes. Many of them are positive. Let me give you an example. In the past, in order to bring or to transport fruits and rice from Mekong Delta provinces of Vietnam to Ho Chi Minh City for selling, it takes 48 hours. But now, they had to use waterway. But now it takes only less than 5 hours, and they use road. And that changed a lot. A lot of floating markets in Vietnam now maintain only for tourist purposes, not for transactions. I think something happened in Thailand also, in Cambodia also. It changed a lot. And livelihood of the people there is much better. But at the same time, how to keep the traditions, and they have to change the traditions, how to change their livelihood, how to maintain or better livelihood in the future. It's a really big problem for the government, local governments in Vietnam. And another issue is the environmental protections, with very much focus on biodiversity conservations. More and more species, animals, fish now being reduced. And the quality of fish coming downstream to Vietnam, and the number of sands, the quantity of sands coming down to the Mekong rivers are very much affected. And I give you an interesting story. The connectivities between South China Sea and Mekong rivers. Because Vietnam is the connecting point between South China Sea and the Mekong outlet. And in the past, without dams, million tons of sand coming down, and they go into the sea. And the sea, the waters close to our coast are very dense. And the quantity and quality of fisheries there is very much better than today. But now when much less sand coming down, the water there is, we call it hungry water. It's not full waters. And when we have hungry waters, it affects very much our coast, and it eats out a lot of coast, and we have to spend a lot of money on that. Whenever we have less waters coming down, so salty waters from South China Sea, especially when the sea level is rising, they come deep into our Mekong rivers, sometimes 80 kilometers away from the coast. And farmers, peasants have to change their agricultural patterns. Some of them have to convert their paddy fields into the shrimp raising farms. And that changed their life a lot. Finally, I think after the breakdown of the dams in Laos, nowadays the perception of dams economic developments in Vietnam and in other Mekong River countries changed a lot in a positive way. Now they talk about building sustainable dams, sustainable water-related developments, and that, I think, will change the future of a Mekong issue. One thing for sure, that water resources will be less and less on the Mekong side, but the salty waters will be more and more. That affects countries like Vietnam. Second, connectivities will be much better and will be even better in the future. That changed the pattern of agriculture and patterns of economic developments. But we need cooperation, and we need sustainable developments, and we welcome external partners to come in to help us, not only on dams, but also on connectivities, on environmental protection, and on water use. So I think I stop here. It's already over. Thank you so much. And I am happy to entertain all of you with Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Let me just follow up on one issue, Dr. Thai. Look, this is the reason we are combining, we are kind of taking an integrated perspective, not just the South China Sea. We've had many workshops and conferences in South China Sea, some on the Mekong, but in fact they should be viewed in totality, in the same frame. You mentioned ASEAN single draft. This is a major achievement this year, and I think Singapore, as a chair, deserves a lot of credit. But when you talk about ASEAN, do you see that the ASEAN divisions over the last several years, have these been narrowed a bit or the same?
I think the division inside ASEAN is still there forever. But consensus in ASEAN is issue-based. With regard to South China Sea, very much, I think so far the gap's closed very much.
So since 2012, widened, but now maybe narrow. Let me now turn to two areas in particular, one by one, the Mekong region and the South China Sea. We have two experts from the campus area. One is Kavi Chongkittavorn. He's the senior fellow with ISIS Thailand, a long-time veteran journalist of the region. He has written extensively on ASEAN, Southeast Asia, many issues, regional affairs. And then after that, I'll come to Carl Middleton.
I have to apologize because I just recovered from a cold for the past 3 days. After listening to my good friend Nguyen Thai, you have the very good impression that the movement in South China Sea is toward a common objective for the regional peace and security. As a Thai, I will give you the perspective on South China Sea and ASEAN's work, what ASEAN is trying to do. Dr. Thitinan asked Dr. Thai about ASEAN's division or ASEAN's sort of a divide or not within the issue of South China Sea. I must say that the past 2 years has been very good. It has been good because ASEAN for the first time has got together. It got together because Philippines, for one, has returned to the ASEAN folds. Before that, as you know, Philippines was a maverick. Philippines under Aquino decided to walk away. I use the word walk away from ASEAN and use other means to get into the other legals. And I think Dr. Thai has mentioned that. That was the worst part of ASEAN, because when you have a member of ASEAN who fail to believe in ASEAN way, who fail to believe in ASEAN collective bargaining power, it has weakened ASEAN greatly. But after the new president came to power, Duterte has in fact given rise to ASEAN more confidence. The fact that Dr. Thai are talking about single draft declaration, without the change of Philippine policy, the single draft would have not been possible. Because as you know, it takes ASEAN 10 to tango to form a consensus. But the most strong voice so far has been the Philippines. That is why it brought the case to arbitration court. So I would say that from ASEAN point of view, these past 2 years has been good. And I would say again that in the next 2 years, it will be better with the Thai and Vietnam as chair of ASEAN. So both countries will be able to work in continuation on the single draft. Why single draft is important? What does it mean? Actually, it means that ASEAN is more unified. Without single draft, ASEAN is separate, is the compilation. Single draft is a compilation of Filipinos draft. Filipinos draft was the most vocal and one of the most difficult draft to deal with. But later on, after discussion, ASEAN were able to put on single draft. That, I think, is very important, and Thailand as the chair of next year, will push to ensure that ASEAN and China will have a complete one. And I must say that the Chan is very good, but I'm the only one who have that kind of optimism, because they still have a lot of obstacle, because certain countries still want certain thing to be added into the draft. Now, my second point is this. Code of conduct is important. Binding, the scale, the scope, we do not know yet. But ASEAN and China must have. Otherwise, it will make the tensions in South China Sea much worse. At the moment, it's calm. Of course, Dr. Thai mentioned a situation like outside is normal, but inside is like a thermos. You know, it's very hot. That could be the case. But I think with code of conduct, it will help ease the situation. And it's very important that this would come about, because, as you know, it's not code of conduct that deal with early warning system, how to engage and manage if there is any conflicts and warnings, happenstance that will occur during the navigations and all that. But the most important for COC is that both China and ASEAN know what they need to do to avoid conflict and to minimize the level of tension. I think that's important. Without this, there would be a consequence that China does not wish to see. As you know, people didn't want to discuss that. Since Xi Jinping came to power, ASEAN and China relation has not been so good. I would be maybe the person who said that, because China approached the so-called new foreign relation with neighboring country has not yet produced the kind of tangible effort, tangible outcome for the region. So I hope that COC would be that one of the tangible outcome in South China Sea. If that come about, you will be able to see by the end of this year some of the wording of President Xi Jinping, the so-called community of shared destiny, will be included in the statements of ASEAN on the future visions of ASEAN relation 2030. This is very important, because in the past, ASEAN and China relations were based on the vision in the past 25 years. And now, the next 25 years have not yet been worked out. So China wants to push its own visions, the so-called community of shared destiny. Whether ASEAN will accept it or not, it depends on what ASEAN think China would be able to give or would be willing to commit in code of conduct. But I would not comment on code of conduct, but just try to say that code of conduct is important because it will impact on the future of ASEAN-China relation. That is my position. On the Mekong cooperation, this is also very interesting because China used different approach in the case of Mekong cooperation. As you know, Mekong cooperation's idea was originated from Thailand, and it was picked up by China 3 years ago, and miraculously China has transformed the whole Mekong region into a different region, even though works of various Mekong organizations, MRC, ADB, and dozens of organizations have not been able to compete with China. Why? There are several reasons. Number one, China want to use Mekong Development Project, particularly Lan Chang, as the model for China engagement with developing countries. And this will be the first time that China, and in the case of Mekong, the riparian country, can work out regulation policy. I have not yet said that it would be a code of conduct, but I'm sure in the future, maybe 5 or 6 years from now, there will be code of conduct in Mekong regarding, Mr. Thai said, water use, regarding the rivers, capacity building, and some other thing. And this is very important why China puts so much attention to the Mekong region. The Mekong region for China is uncontested because you have so many countries down below. They live on and then they get together. Of course, they sit down, they work out. Working with Mekong country, 5 of them are ASEAN member, is much easier than the ASEAN member, which are 10 countries. So some suggestion that in the futures, Mekong would be put into the agenda of ASEAN is still something that we still have to wait and see. Furthermore, I would like to say that China is trying to close the gap between Mekong and between Mekong riparian country and China, so that they 6 countries can operate without outside interference. And this is important because it will establish, this is my own take, because I think China has been trying since Xi Jinping came to power, tries to establish the kind of China-led norm, China-led even a small regional order. And I think Mekong is rather an unusual playground for China to do that. Why? If you notice carefully, China has been very considerate in the sense that it has been looking at complaints from local grassroots organizations, complaints from the NGO. China has been very careful also with some of the issue related to environment. And I think China wants to use Lan Chang Mekong or Mekong Lan Chang as a showcase, because if this fails, it will impact on the much bigger connectivity project. You have BRI and many other things. And in my discussion, I always said that Lan Chang Mekong is not China backyard. It is China front yard, Qianmen, not Homen. Why? Because if it Homen, China would not pay much attention. We will not exercise so much investment money. Now have been spending over 3 million fundings for many projects. Some of them, of course, only named, but more and more are coming. So I think the notion that Lan Chang is front yard is very real, and China would like to do that. So in contrast with South China Sea and Lan Chang, you can see the different how China approach. If overall ASEAN feels that China intention both in South China Sea and Mekong work well, and that it fit into the ASEAN vision statement, I think in the end, and I will add, ASEAN will accept Xi Jinping believe that China and neighboring country can form a community of shared destiny. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Speaker Wee. I want to just elaborate before I invite Dr. Carl Middleton to speak on this front yard, backyard notion. In fact, the distinction is very sharp because normally we would think of mainland Southeast Asia as the backyard. But in fact, the Lanchang Mekong, China may be trying to use it as a showcase, as Khun Kavi mentioned, as an example, as a model for other ventures and schemes along the Belt and Road especially. And just to draw some contrast between the Mekong region and South China Sea, in the Mekong region, unlike the South China Sea, the South China Sea has all kinds of players. Major powers, it's a vital waterway for half of the world's shipping and livelihood, energy security, and so on. But in the Mekong area, only China is a major power. A little bit of Japan, but no other major powers involved. Mainly is the riparian countries, the countries involved, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. That's one distinction. Another one is that unlike the South China Sea, which didn't have an organizing structure, governing framework, the Mekong region has had some. Under the Greater Mekong sub-region since the early 1990s, there's a Mekong Agreement, there's a Mekong Institute, there's a Mekong River Commission, been around for 23 years now. So unlike the South China Sea, the Mekong region has had some regional governance, even though it was loose, it was not tight, and perhaps not as effective, but now it has been superseded by the Lanchang Mekong Corporation, LMC, which in short 3 years, it has gone a very long way, it has had two summits, several work programs, and it's really the only deal in town now. So on that note, let me just invite Dr. Carl Middleton, who is a lecturer at our faculty. He's done a lot of research on the ground with the Mekong communities, Mekong issues, also including a dam construction. Dr. Carl.
Thank you, Ajahn Thitinan. It's a great pleasure to join this panel, and thank you for making space for me to talk. So I was asked to talk about water politics and to focus on the Mekong, and it seems to me that water politics is never far from being in the news in this region. To take a couple of very recent examples, the first that Dr. Tai mentioned, the Zipian Zinam Noi dam disaster in July 2018. So this was a very large dam break in Attapur province in southern Laos. As of September 25, 40 people officially are confirmed dead, and almost 100 still missing, and 6,600 still displaced. I think this is a very important event in the sense that it raises significant questions about the approach to hydropower and more broadly the approach to development in Laos. A key question is who will take responsibility for the impacts of this project. These are companies coming from Korea, Thailand and Laos, and finance from Korea and Thailand. And what impact should it have on the broader hydropower sector, including regionally, given that these are regional economic integration projects with power trade. And the second one was an event that happened last week. So controversy broke out during a project's prior consultation in Vientiane. So the Pak Lai Dam was proposed for a regional consultation process, and it was discovered that the project document, the Transboundary Environmental Impact Assessment, was almost 90% cut and paste from a previous mainstream dam project. I think this raises certain questions about the quality of assessments that are being conducted on the plans for the Mekong River. And also significantly, this project, the regional consultation, was initiated just days after the Lao government had announced that it was temporarily suspending all new proposals for mainstream for dam projects in light of the Zipian Zinam Noi disaster. So it raises questions about the quality of the studies and the accountability of the processes. And then, as Ajahn Thitinan just mentioned, there's been two leadership summits this year that directly address cooperation on the Lanchang Mekong River. The first was the third Mekong River Commission Summit in Siem Reap, Cambodia, that marked 23 years after the Mekong Agreement. And the second was the second Lanchang Mekong Cooperation Leaders Summit in Phnom Penh, which is only 2 years after the first summit was held in Sanya City, Yunnan province of China. And the key questions that are raised in this case are, how are these two different institutions going to cooperate? And what will be the future principles of transboundary water cooperation on the Mekong River? So I want to provide some background, some sense of how the river is changing. Since the early 1990s, the Lancang-Mekong River has largely transformed from a free-flowing river to one that's increasingly engineered by hydropower dams. The river has massive hydropower potential. The earliest projects were actually built in northeast Thailand, but these were in the 1960s and 1970s mostly, with the support of USAID and the World Bank. Yet today, relative to neighbouring countries, Thailand's domestic hydropower in the basin is quite small, but Thailand imports over 2,000 megawatts from Laos, neighbouring Laos. But it's been China's construction on the Lancang-Mekong River in the early 1990s that really heralded a new era of hydropolitics, with 6 large dams now in operation. These projects largely export their power to the eastern seaboard in China, but now China has surplus energy or surplus electricity, which means it may be looking to sell electricity to Southeast Asia. Vietnam, meanwhile, has constructed 12 large dams domestically within the Mekong Basin, and then also is importing electricity from central Laos and southern Laos, and also somewhat from China. So what this reflects is a broadening power trade and an increasing extensive construction of large dams across the region. Cambodia, too, has also started building dams in the Mekong Basin, the Lower Se San 2 in particular. So what have been the hydrological and ecological impacts of these large dams? So one thing is that the Lancang-Mekong is what we call a flood pulse ecology. So it's a product of the monsoonal climate. That means during the rainy season between June and November, 80% of the river's water flows. And in the dry season, the river drops to be relatively low. As of 2008, the total dam storage capacity across the whole basin was less than 2% of the total water. But this could increase to 20% by 2030. So this is a magnitude of the extent of engineering that's ongoing in the basin. And in particular, that would redistribute water from the rainy season to the dry season. And therefore, it would change the hydrology and it would change the ecology. So there are potential benefits and also definite harms. The potential benefits include more water available for irrigation in the dry season, potentially better navigation, and hydropower. And engineers also claim that this would enable better regulation of the river for droughts and floods. But the negative impacts, to name but a few, are the impacts on the wild fisheries that are increasingly under threat, the impacts on wider river ecologies, and the impacts on riverside gardening. And I think one very important thing to appreciate in this region is the importance of the river to rural livelihoods, especially those that live in extreme poverty. For example, regarding fisheries, one study estimated that if the current large dams under construction are completed on the mainstream, there'd be 16% reduction in fisheries. If all 11 mainstream dams in the lower Mekong are built, the loss of fisheries could be between 26 and 42%. And this would have impacts on food security, and the poorest would be particularly vulnerable, as they depend the most on the wild capture fisheries. Turning to the control of the headwater, so during the dry season, China's contribution to the total river flow is particularly significant because there's not much rain in the lower basin, and it's glacial snow water that melts that comes down into the basin. So before major dam construction in the 1990s, China contributed 10% of the rainy season flow, total rainy season flow, but 30% in the dry season. But a recent study calculated that for the first 6 dams that have now been built, it reflects a total storage capacity of 40% of the total annual flow at the lowest point of the dams. And the authors predict that the dams will increase the dry season flow between 30 and 150%, whilst reducing the rainy season flow between 29 and 36%. So for China, this has given a far greater control over the headwaters. It's good for electricity generation. Potentially it can deal with some droughts, but it also affects the sediment, as Dr. Tran mentioned, Dr. Tai mentioned, and also for riverside communities downstream, especially in northern Thailand and northern Laos, they've reported many ecological changes that affect their livelihoods. I think all of these changes raise a really important question about what will be the future principles of transboundary water cooperation on the Lancang-Mekong River. Will it be hydrodiplomacy? Now, China's dams were built unilaterally without prior notification to downstream countries. According to one researcher, Darren McGee, there were 5 principles that guided the construction and operation in the 1990s and 2000s. These included meeting domestic energy needs, electricity integration with neighboring countries, and the rational and equitable use of water. And this emphasized China's territorial sovereignty, but also recognized that there could be a contribution to drought mitigation and flood protection downstream. Signaling that the extent to which China now possesses significant storage capacity, 1 week before the Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation Summit in 2016, China offered to release water from the Lanchang dams in order to alleviate a severe drought that was affecting both China and downstream countries. According to China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman at the time, China's release of water shows the effectiveness of water facilities to help control floods and droughts. However, the Thai media also reported the unpredictable water releases had deleterious impacts on riverside communities downstream. So therefore, another question is hydrohegemony. So more broadly, this sort of debate in 2016 raised some commentators to ask whether headwater control was not hydrodiplomacy, but in fact it was hydrohegemony. So one article in particular by Professor Chaleni, a professor at the Center for Policy Research in India, elicited a strong public rebuttal from China's academics, Tian Fuqiang and Li Hu. Now, I won't go into the details of what they wrote, but I think the significance of the debate in mid-2016 was the assertion of a new principle of water cooperation, namely reciprocity, and I'll come back to this later. As Dr. Thitinan mentioned, there's growing momentum behind the Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation Framework. So it's now 2.5 years since the first summit in Sanya City. The summit signified China's shift from a bilateral to a multilateral engagement towards Southeast Asia and challenged other great powers in the region and their regional initiatives, which included the US, Europe, Japan, and Korea. The second Leaders' Summit in Phnom Penh, 2.5 years later, revealed the swift pace and the ambition of the Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation, as detailed in a 5-year plan and also the Phnom Penh Declaration. When I was researching for this presentation, I was amazed how quickly this initiative is moving. Reflecting the Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation's deepening institutionalization, there have been 3 annual foreign ministers' meetings, numerous government official meetings and trainings, and joint working groups on 6 priority areas. In addition, there's now a Lanchang-Mekong Secretariat and a Lanchang-Mekong Water Resources Cooperation Center established in March 2017, and a Lanchang-Mekong Environmental Cooperation Center established in November 2017, all based in Beijing. In addition, there's been a number of early harvest projects, 45 after Sanya and 132 in Phnom Penh, funded by China. Accompanying these, the summits have been many declarations about water and the river in particular. In the Phnom Penh statement and the 5-year plan, it stated that cooperation will be through policy dialogue, water monitoring, technical cooperation, joint research, capacity building, and the creation of a Lanchang-Mekong Cooperation Forum. To date, there have been joint working groups held twice about water, the first in Beijing in February 2017, and the second in Chiang Rai in March 2018. But this process to date has been very intergovernmental centric. There's been a lack of transparency and very little space for civil society and the community to share their knowledge and concerns. What of the Mekong River Commission? So as Ajahn Thitinan mentioned, in 1995, the 4 lower Mekong countries established the Mekong River Commission to strengthen transboundary water governance. And in principle, relative to the LMC, it's more based on written down rules. The MRC has created an extensive knowledge base, and it's conducted a range of recent studies that are significant to knowing the Mekong River, such as a strategic environmental assessment of the impact of mainstream dams, and a so-called council study that looks at the region more broadly. Until recently, China maintained a very distant relationship with the MRC. Stuart Bieber has argued this was only limited to times when there was increasing tensions either over drought or flooding. But more recently, the MRC has been building a closer relationship with the LMC And I think it's engaged in two ways. The MRC has both tried to assert its own legitimacy to be a river basin organization, whilst trying to demonstrate its cooperation with the LMC. So regarding legitimacy, the MRC regularly states that it's the only organization mandated by international treaty, and it undertakes basin-wide planning. It's held 3 summits, and it holds annual ministerial level meetings. It says that it's more transparent and inclusive, although I think this is not flawless. As I mentioned at the beginning, the so-called procedures for prior notification for the mainstream dams, this time around the civil society groups boycotted it. But on the other hand, there have been increasing examples of collaboration between the LMC and the MRC, including data sharing, joining each other's meetings, dialogue meetings, and some joint research. But I think it's obvious to everyone that watches this closely that there are very clearly overlapping mandates. And at present, even if the MRC is more consolidated and rules-based, the LMC is more proactive, as Ajahn Thitinan was also suggesting. So now, finally turning to this concept of reciprocity. I think the important thing here is that it seems to be a new principle for water cooperation that China is advocating for. So in 1997, the UN Watercourses Convention was adopted globally, and it came into force in August 2014 after Vietnam became the 35th country to ratify it. The key clauses in the UN Watercourses Convention are equitable and reasonable utilization and due diligence to avoid significant harm. And this Watercourses Convention is the basis of the MRC. The 1995 Mekong Agreement is also organized around these principles. At the time of the UN Watercourses adoption, 3 countries, including China, voted against the convention, considering that it overly privileged the interest of downstream countries, and that it would not be in China's interest, given that hydropower dam construction was accelerating at the time. 20 years later, Dr. Zhong Yong from Tsinghua University was the lead author of an academic paper titled Rivers and Reciprocity, Perceptions and Policy on International Watercourses. The paper concludes that the UN Watercourses Convention did not consider how downstream development of water resources could limit the proposed development upstream. Thus, it is claimed that the UN Watercourses Convention is misunderstood by downstream states who do not respect their responsibility to upstream states. So the overall argument is that downstream states need to acknowledge the rights of upstream states to develop and to not preclude that development by developing downstream. And thus, reciprocity is the principle for transboundary equity. Now, the significance of the paper is that it is basically trying to reevaluate established international norms on transboundary river governance, and this would better reflect China's interest. And this claim is significant because the lead author of the paper, Dr. Zhong Yong, is now the Secretary General of the Lanchang Mekong Water Resources Cooperation Center, and is therefore framing the approach of the center in the engagement with downstream countries. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do in this brief intervention is to describe a little bit what's changing in the Mekong River and how that is affecting local communities as well as the geopolitics. And then I've drawn attention in particular to China's upstream dams. I think the rise of the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation Framework is significant, and it has implications for the MRC. It brings in a new dynamic between the 2 organizations, and I think there are opportunities and pitfalls ahead. And it could lead either to deepening contestation or deepening cooperation, but certainly there will be water politics involved. I think the opportunities are maybe twofold. The one is that the LMC and the MRC coming together for the first time geographically covers the entire basin. And the second is that reciprocity could be an entry point to serious intergovernmental negotiation beyond the Mekong Agreement, which China disagrees with because it's based upon the UN Watercourses Convention. But I think China is yet to make a strong case that reciprocity actually applies to the Mekong region. In other words, have the downstream countries actually limited the upstream countries' development? Because I think historically there's little evidence to show that China has tempered its behavior upstream respecting the idea of reciprocity. In particular, because the dams were developed unilaterally, there was no prior negotiation. I think a second question is, how does reciprocity address past harm that's been created from the projects? And then related to this, at the moment, everything is framed around water, physical water. But actually, rivers are more than water. Rivers are fish, rivers are culture. So I think the reciprocity has to be widened a lot more to include a wider range of values for the river. And I think more broadly, whilst it may be an interesting concept, it doesn't actually deal with the power asymmetries between countries. So how can the negotiations proceed, recognizing the different power dynamics between upstream and downstream? And then my final and perhaps my most important point is that all of this discussion so far is very state-centric, with limited participation, transparency, and accountability, especially to riparian communities. And this needs to be put far more to the front. Thank you very much.